What happens when a gang built on fear wakes up in a world that no longer fears it? Australia's rebels once ruled streets with roaring engines, silent threats, and clubhouse doors that never needed locks. Power meant presence. Loyalty meant blood. Then the cameras multiplied, laws sharpened, and the internet remembered everything. This is the story of how intimidation lost its edge, how secrecy collapsed under screenshots, and how a street empire didn't fall in flames, but faded, pixel by pixel. Rebels MC. When fear was enough. In the early 2000s, the Rebels Motorcycle Club did not need slogans, press, or explanation. Their power lived in silence. A line of patched riders outside a pub could empty a room faster than police sirens. Business owners knew which nights to close early. Rivals knew when to look away. For years, Rebels MC dominated large stretches of Australia's bikie landscape, not because they were the biggest, but because they were unpredictable. Fear filled the gaps where rules failed. The club's rise was built on visibility. Loud engines, public rides, and confrontational appearances were not accidents. They were messages. Each ride reinforced territorial control. Each public standoff reminded everyone that rebels did not hide. At a time when law enforcement relied on reactive policing, the rebels exploited delay. By the time warrants were signed, meetings had ended and trails were cold. This rhythm allowed the club to operate in plain sight while remaining untouchable. Digital evidence changed everything. Phones turned members into walking recorders. Social media posts, once used to intimidate rivals, became timestamps and location tags. Messages meant to coordinate rides were replayed in courtrooms. Encrypted apps slowed investigations, but did not stop them. One seized phone could unravel years of operations. The club that thrived on loyalty began bleeding from informants, not out of betrayal, but survival. Public perception shifted as well. Media coverage stopped mythologizing bikie culture and started documenting consequences. Asset seizures replaced dramatic raids as the real punishment. Clubhouses were padlocked, sold, or demolished. The image of freedom on two wheels was replaced by court sketches and bankruptcy notices. Younger recruits looked elsewhere, drawn to faster money online and identities that did not require prison time. Internal fractures followed external pressure. As senior figures faced long sentences, leadership became unstable. Decisions slowed. Trust eroded. Chapters disagreed on risk. Some wanted to retreat and go quiet. Others doubled down, clinging to old rules that no longer worked. The unity that once defined Rebels MC fractured into competing survival strategies, each weakening the whole. What finally broke the spell was inevitability. The Rebels did not lose a single war. They lost the environment that made them powerful. A world of cameras, databases, and digital memory does not forget intimidation. It records it. In that world, fear is temporary, but evidence is permanent. The Rebels Motorcycle Club became a case study in how dominance built on presence collapses when presence becomes traceable. This was not a dramatic ending. No final showdown, no last ride, just a slow erosion. Members aging out, chapters shrinking, influence dissolving. They faded as relevance slipped from street corners into archived files, proving that power dependent on fear rarely survives the moment fear stops working. Comanchero MC. From brotherhood to liability, the rise of the Comanchero Motorcycle Club was built on an idea more powerful than fear: brotherhood. Where other clubs relied on intimidation alone, the Comancheros sold identity. Their patch promised unity, discipline, and a code that demanded absolute loyalty. For years, that promise worked. Members didn't just belong to a club, they belonged to a closed world where protection, income, and status were guaranteed, as long as rules were followed without question. This structure made the Comancheros formidable. Hierarchy was rigid. Orders flowed downward and were obeyed. Disputes were handled internally, often violently, but efficiently. The club's strength came from control, not chaos. To outsiders, it looked like stability. To law enforcement, it looked like an organization waiting to be dismantled piece by piece. The tighter the structure, the easier it was to map once pressure increased. Crackdowns transformed loyalty into risk. Anti-consorting laws meant members could be charged simply for being together. Financial tracking turned shared assets into shared liabilities. One reckless act no longer endangered a single rider. It threatened entire chapters. Brotherhood stopped feeling protective and started feeling heavy. Younger members questioned why they should absorb consequences for decisions they didn't make. Older members resented carrying the weight of constant surveillance. Technology accelerated that shift. Internal communications that once strengthened coordination now created permanent records. Messages meant to reinforce loyalty were later dissected in court to prove conspiracy. The same discipline that demanded constant check-ins also created consistent digital trails. For the first time, silence became safer than solidarity. Members began distancing themselves not out of fear of rivals, but fear of association. The media narrative flipped sharply. Once portrayed as elite and organized, the Comancheros were reframed as predictable and exposed. Every arrest reinforced the idea that belonging to the club increased legal risk without guaranteeing protection. Court cases revealed internal conflicts, power struggles, and financial mismanagement. The myth of unity cracked in public view, and once a brotherhood loses mystique, it loses recruits. Internal trust deteriorated fastest. Loyalty depends on belief that sacrifice is shared. When informants emerged, even a few, paranoia spread. Meetings shortened, attendance dropped. Leaders tightened control, but that only pushed uncertainty deeper. Rules multiplied. Punishments intensified. What was once a brotherhood began to feel like a surveillance state of its own, where members watched each other as closely as police did. The financial model collapsed quietly. Traditional income streams became high risk and low return under scrutiny. Asset seizures erased years of accumulation overnight. Legal fees drained club funds faster than they could be replaced. Without reliable money, loyalty weakened further. Brotherhood, without benefit, is just obligation, and obligation is fragile under pressure. Bandidos MC. When expansion became exposure. For years, the Bandidos motorcycle club treated growth as survival. Expansion meant strength. New chapters meant new revenue, new influence, and new buffers against rivals. Australia became fertile ground for that strategy. Territory spread across states, patches multiplied, and the brand carried global recognition. But what once insulated the club eventually made it visible from every angle, turning expansion into its greatest weakness. The Bandidos model depended on scale. Large numbers created intimidation, and intimidation created opportunity. Public rides were deliberately oversized. Clubhouses were established as fixed anchors, symbols of permanence. This approach worked in an era when policing struggled to coordinate across jurisdictions. But as agencies began sharing intelligence nationally, the same footprint that projected power also provided a roadmap. The bigger the organization became, the easier it was to chart. Visibility reshaped enforcement tactics. Instead of targeting individuals, authorities targeted infrastructure. Clubhouses were surveilled, financial links traced, and travel patterns logged. Expansion had created consistency, and consistency created predictability. Members followed established routes, routines, and hierarchies. What felt like order internally looked like structure externally, and structure is vulnerable to analysis. Internal strain followed external pressure. Rapid growth diluted trust. New members did not share the same history or discipline as older ones. Vetting weakened. Loyalty became assumed rather than earned. As law enforcement pressure intensified, these weak links snapped first. Informants emerged not from betrayal, but from misalignment. Some recruits joined for image, not obligation, and image fades quickly under threat. Technology accelerated the unraveling. Group chats meant to coordinate chapters created sprawling webs of association. A message sent casually could implicate dozens. Photos meant to show unity became proof of presence. The club's own documentation, culture patch ceremonies, rides, gatherings fed evidence databases. Expansion had created content, and content became leverage. Financial exposure was the turning point. Larger operations required larger money flows. Cash movement became harder to disguise. Unexplained wealth orders and asset freezes disrupted income chains. Where expansion once diversified risk, it now concentrated it. One seizure rippled across chapters, stalling operations far beyond the original target. Legal costs mounted, draining funds faster than they could be replaced. Public perception shifted as scale stopped inspiring fear. Media coverage emphasized numbers arrested rather than numbers riding. Court cases revealed coordination failures and internal disputes. The image of an unstoppable force fractured into stories of mismanagement and overreach. Potential recruits saw risk without reward. Older members saw diminishing returns on loyalty. Momentum slowed. Leadership faced impossible choices: pull back and lose territory, or push forward and increase exposure. Either option carried consequences. Retrenchment signaled weakness. Expansion invited scrutiny. The Bandidos had built an identity around growth, and without it, purpose blurred. Chapters began acting independently, eroding cohesion. A decentralized structure offered short-term survival but long-term decline. Hells Angels MC legacy trapped in the spotlight. The Hells Angels motorcycle club entered Australia with something no other club could claim: legend. Their name carried global weight, built over decades of mythology, violence, and cultural fascination. That reputation alone opened doors and closed mouths. For years, Australian chapters benefited from inherited fear. They did not need to prove themselves locally. The brand did the work before engines even started. Legacy was their shield. Older members believed history itself offered protection. Rival clubs hesitated, businesses complied. Even police tread carefully, knowing that every move against the Hells Angels attracted scrutiny. This visibility was double-edged. It granted status, but it also ensured constant attention. Unlike smaller clubs that could fade into obscurity, the Hells Angels were never allowed to disappear. As time passed, the legend hardened into expectation. Members were required to uphold an image forged in another era. That image demanded public presence, large runs, and symbolic displays of strength. Silence felt like weakness. Retreat felt like betrayal of the name. In a changing enforcement landscape, this refusal to shrink became dangerous. What once defined dominance now guaranteed exposure. Law enforcement adapted around that predictability. Long-term surveillance replaced reaction. Task forces studied patterns rather than personalities. The Hells Angels' commitment to tradition created routines that could be anticipated. Meetings followed known schedules. Clubhouses became fixed observation points. The club's pride in consistency allowed authorities to build cases patiently, without urgency. Technology undermined mystique. Media no longer romanticized the patch. Instead, it contextualized it. Court documents replaced folklore. Arrests were reported with financial figures, seized assets, and sentence lengths. The mythology that once attracted recruits began to repel them. Younger generations, raised online, saw legacy as liability. Fame no longer meant power, it meant exposure. Internal conflict followed generational lines. Senior members clung to tradition, believing survival depended on staying the same. Younger members questioned why visibility mattered more than longevity. This tension slowed decision-making. Adaptation stalled. In a world that rewarded flexibility, the Hells Angels doubled down on identity, mistaking endurance for strategy. Financial pressure deepened the strain. High-profile status meant high-profile investigations. Assets linked to the club faced constant scrutiny. Legal defenses consumed resources. The cost of maintaining legend grew heavier than its benefits. Where the name once opened revenue streams, it now closed them. Businesses avoided association. Transactions moved slower, riskier. The spotlight never dimmed. Every incident involving any chapter worldwide reflected back on local members. Australian chapters carried the burden of global reputation without global insulation. Actions taken elsewhere triggered consequences locally. The Hells Angels were no longer judged as individuals or chapters, but as a single organism. That collective accountability magnified risk. Over time, the club adjusted. but cautiously. Visibility decreased, but never disappeared. Influence narrowed to select regions. Operations became quieter, but the name ensured they were never invisible. The Hells Angels did not collapse like lesser-known clubs. Their decline was subtler, marked by contraction rather than destruction. What defined their fall was not failure, but stagnation. A legacy too heavy to discard, too rigid to reshape. In an era where power depends on adaptability, the Hells Angels remained loyal to a version of themselves forged decades earlier. That loyalty preserved identity, but cost relevance. Finks MC, pride, exposure, and the cost of noise.
You've got some pretty heavy-duty security.
You don't leave your front door open at home. You sit out in the backyard.
Yeah, but I don't put...
The Finks Motorcycle Club built its reputation differently. Where others relied on legacy or scale, Finks leaned into attitude. Loud colors, aggressive public presence, a deliberate rejection of subtlety. The club projected defiance as identity, turning confrontation into currency. For years, that posture worked. Visibility created fear, and fear translated into space to operate, to recruit, to expand without explanation. Finks MC thrived on being seen. Clubhouses were statements, not hideouts. Public rides were choreographed displays of unity. Media attention was not avoided. It was absorbed and repurposed as proof of relevance. Every headline, even negative, reinforced the idea that the club mattered. In a culture where intimidation depended on reputation, noise became power. But noise does not age well. As policing shifted from reactive force to long-term intelligence, Finks' visibility stopped being intimidating and started being convenient. Surveillance did not need infiltration when members documented themselves. Cameras did not need to chase when club activities announced their own locations. The same bravado that once signaled strength now removed uncertainty, the very thing fear depends on. Legal pressure accumulated slowly. Anti-consorting laws meant association itself became an offense. Public gatherings created instant evidence. What had once been symbolic displays of dominance were reframed as deliberate defiance of legislation. Courts did not see confidence. They saw provocation. Each charge reinforced a narrative that the club could not or would not adapt. Internal consequences followed. Visibility attracts attention, but it also attracts scrutiny from within. Members began questioning strategy. Was loudness still protection, or was it invitation? Younger recruits, raised in an era of digital permanence, understood that exposure carries long memory. Old rules, never talk, never record lost relevance when the club's own image did the talking. Media framing accelerated decline. Early coverage fixated on spectacle. Later reporting focused on outcomes, arrests, convictions, asset seizures. Fear relies on unpredictability. Once outcomes became predictable, fear weakened. Businesses stopped reacting emotionally and started cooperating pragmatically. Intimidation lost efficiency. Financial stress revealed fragility. Visibility discouraged legitimate fronts and attracted regulatory oversight. Cash flows tightened. Legal defenses drained resources. Without sustainable income, loyalty frayed. The cost of being a Fink began to outweigh the benefits. Membership numbers stalled. Recruitment slowed. Pride could not replace profit. Leadership faced a dilemma. Retreating contradicted identity. Doubling down increased risk. The club's culture had been built around presence, not discretion. Rebranding felt like surrender, but refusal to change invited extinction. This paralysis proved fatal. While other clubs reduced exposure quietly, Finks struggled to recalibrate without abandoning what made them recognizable. Over time, chapters shrank. Activity became cautious, selective. The loudness softened, but the reputation lingered long enough to keep pressure high. Silence arrived too late to erase history. Digital records preserved years of defiance, ready to be replayed whenever necessary. Noise does not disappear. It echoes. The decline of Finks MC illustrates a simple truth. Intimidation must evolve or expire. Mongols MC, importing chaos into a controlled system. When the Mongols Motorcycle Club arrived in Australia, they brought a reputation forged elsewhere: raw, confrontational, and unapologetically violent. Unlike older clubs that had evolved alongside Australian bikie culture, the Mongols entered as outsiders with something to prove. Their strategy was disruption. Shock value replaced subtlety. Conflict became branding. For a brief period, that volatility worked, because unpredictability unsettles systems that rely on routine. The Mongols did not attempt to blend in. Their presence was meant to feel invasive. Public appearances were confrontational by design, signaling refusal to respect existing hierarchies. This antagonistic posture attracted attention quickly, both from rivals and authorities. But attention was the point. The club's identity thrived on reaction. Every confrontation reinforced relevance. Every response confirmed impact. Australia, however, was not an open frontier. The enforcement environment had matured through decades of dealing with organized bikie groups. Laws were already tailored. Databases were already built. Intelligence sharing was already normalized. The Mongols were stepping into a system prepared for them. Their chaos did not confuse the system, it activated it. Rapid response replaced observation. Where older clubs benefited from familiarity, the Mongols triggered immediate containment. Internal cohesion became a challenge. Rapid expansion, without deep roots, created uneven loyalty. Members joined for confrontation, not patience. Discipline suffered. Strategic silence clashed with impulsive behavior. Each incident invited scrutiny not just of individuals, but of the entire organization. The Mongols' reputation ensured that no action was treated as isolated. Everything was contextualized as pattern. Technology compounded the pressure. Confrontational identity encourages documentation. Incidents were filmed, shared, and archived by supporters and critics alike. What was meant to intimidate instead created timelines. Law enforcement did not need undercover access when evidence circulated publicly. The club's image management, once an asset, became self-incrimination. Rivalries accelerated decline. Established clubs understood the long game. They could afford restraint. The Mongols could not. Conflict drained resources and attention, diverting focus from consolidation. Every clash justified further surveillance. The club became defined not by territory or income, but by incidents. Identity narrowed into liability. Financial sustainability proved elusive. High-risk behavior discouraged stable revenue. Asset seizures arrived early. Legal fees escalated quickly. Without time to build resilient financial structures, the Mongols operated under constant deficit. Members faced a stark reality: high exposure with diminishing return. Loyalty weakens when sacrifice yields only scrutiny. Leadership struggled to recalibrate. The identity that fueled recruitment also blocked adaptation. Reducing confrontation risked irrelevance. Maintaining it guaranteed enforcement. This trap left few exits. Chapters shrank as pressure mounted. Recruitment slowed as consequences became visible. The aura of danger lost appeal when paired with certainty of prosecution. Public narrative hardened rapidly. Media coverage skipped myth-building and moved straight to outcomes. Arrests replaced rumors. Court proceedings replaced speculation. The Mongols never enjoyed the grace period older clubs had once benefited from. They were introduced to the public, already framed as a problem to be solved. Ultimately, the Mongols MC encountered a system that punished speed. Their model depended on rapid impact, but Australia's environment rewarded patience and punished visibility. Chaos failed to destabilize institutions built to absorb it. The club did not collapse from within alone. It was compressed by an ecosystem designed to limit disruption. Gypsy MC. Isolation in an age of intelligence. For decades, the Gypsy Jokers motorcycle club survived by staying regional. Their strength was not size or global branding, but distance. Operating primarily in Western Australia, the club benefited from geography, tight-knit membership, and a culture that favored silence over spectacle. They did not chase attention, they avoided unnecessary expansion. For a long time, that restraint kept them insulated from the kind of pressure that dismantled louder organizations. The Gypsy Jokers model relied on familiarity. Members often grew up together, shared histories, and trusted one another deeply. This reduced internal leaks and minimized reckless behavior. Decisions were slower, more deliberate. Conflict was handled quietly. In an era when many clubs confused visibility with power, the Gypsy Jokers treated invisibility as protection. Fear existed locally, reinforced by reputation rather than performance. But isolation only works when systems are fragmented. As law enforcement coordination improved nationally, regional distance stopped being a barrier. Intelligence sharing erased geographic advantage. Information gathered in one state traveled instantly to another. The Gypsy Joker's low profile no longer guaranteed anonymity. Silence was still practiced, but silence alone could not counter data aggregation. Historical incidents returned with force. Old cases were revisited using modern forensic methods. Testimonies once considered unreliable were re-examined. Associations long rumored were formally documented. The club's past, previously obscured by time and local loyalty, became evidence. What had once been buried by distance resurfaced through databases and renewed investigations. Technology eroded their strongest asset: trust. Phones introduced uncertainty into even the closest circles. Encrypted communication offered temporary comfort, but devices still logged metadata. Patterns emerged, movements aligned. The club's consistency, once a sign of discipline, created predictability. Predictability is exploitable when observation is patient. Media exposure, though limited, was surgical. Coverage focused less on spectacle and more on legacy crimes and long-term impact. This reframing stripped the club of mystique. Instead of appearing controlled and disciplined, they were presented as remnants of an older era, struggling to exist in a transparent system. Younger audiences saw history, not opportunity. Recruitment slowed significantly. The appeal of joining a closed, regional club diminished in a connected world. Potential members weighed loyalty against isolation, tradition against adaptability. Many chose not to commit. Without fresh blood, chapters aged. Aging brings caution, but it also brings vulnerability. Health issues, financial strain, and legal fatigue reduced operational capacity. Financial resilience weakened quietly. Smaller-scale operations meant fewer buffers against disruption. Asset seizures, even limited ones, hit harder. Legal expenses consumed shared resources. Without diversified income or external alliances, recovery was slow. The club's deliberate pace, once an advantage, now delayed response to pressure. Leadership faced a dilemma unique to restraint-based organizations. Expanding risked exposure. Remaining small risked irrelevance. The Gypsy Jokers had survived by not changing, but survival strategies lose effectiveness as environments evolve. What once looked like wisdom began to resemble inertia. The club did not implode. There was no dramatic collapse. Instead, influence receded. Territory narrowed. Activity became cautious to the point of stagnation. Presence faded from public consciousness, not because fear intensified, but because relevance diminished. Silence turned from shield to signal of decline. The story of the Gypsy Jokers MC is not one of reckless failure, but of strategic exploration. Their model was perfectly suited to a fragmented past and poorly suited to a connected present. In a world where intelligence flows freely and history can be reassembled at will, isolation is temporary. Eventually, distance closes, data accumulates, and even the quietest organizations are found. When that happens, survival depends not on silence, but on transformation. And transformation came too slowly. Coffin MC, veterans in a world that moved on.
His bikie clubhouse in Beaconsfield. One man has been arrested for kidnapping and extortion, and police say a simultaneous dawn raid on his house uncovered
The Coffin Cheetahs Motorcycle Club occupied a unique space in Australia's bikie ecosystem. Founded by military veterans, the club built its identity on discipline, hierarchy, and a strong sense of order. Unlike younger or more chaotic groups, the Coffin Cheetahs valued structure. Commands were clear. Behavior was regulated. For years, this military-style organization insulated the club from the instability that plagued others. That discipline translated into restraint. The Coffin Cheetahs avoided unnecessary conflicts and public spectacles. Their members understood consequences and preferred control over chaos. This approach allowed them to operate beneath the noise of louder clubs, earning a reputation as professional and measured. In a landscape defined by bravado, their calm carried weight. Fear did not come from unpredictability, but from certainty. However, Discipline alone could not stop environmental change. As Australia's legal framework tightened, the very structure that once protected the club became a liability. Clear chains of command simplified prosecution. Defined roles clarified responsibility. What once prevented disorder now provided prosecutors with clean narratives of organization and intent. Military-style hierarchy does not translate well in courtrooms built to dismantle command structures. Technology exposed generational gaps. Many senior members came from eras where silence meant survival. Phones were tools, not extensions of identity. Younger associates, however, lived differently. Digital habits clashed with old rules. Photos surfaced, messages lingered, even limited online exposure contradicted decades of caution. The club struggled to enforce traditions in a culture that normalized constant recording. Public perception also shifted. The veteran origin story once carried respect. Over time, media narratives reframed it as contradiction. Service records were contrasted with criminal charges. Discipline was reframed as organization. Loyalty was reframed as conspiracy. The symbolic shield of military association lost effectiveness in a society less willing to separate background from behavior. Recruitment slowed as identity blurred. Younger prospects no longer viewed military discipline as aspirational. The romanticism of structure faded in favor of flexibility and low visibility. Joining a highly organized group meant inheriting its scrutiny. The cost-benefit equation changed. Pride could not compensate for long sentences and constant observation. Financial pressure intensified quietly. The Coffin cheaters' smaller scale limited revenue diversity. Asset seizures, even targeted ones, had outsized impact. Legal costs drained collective resources. Discipline delayed collapse, but it could not create new income streams under pressure. Stability turned into stagnation as opportunities narrowed. Leadership faced difficult choices. Adaptation risked undermining the very identity that defined the club. Modernizing communication challenged old values. Reducing hierarchy weakened control. Maintaining tradition ensured continuity but limited evolution. The club chose preservation over transformation, believing endurance itself was success. Over time, endurance became erosion. Chapters aged, activity decreased, influence receded without confrontation. The Coffin cheaters did not fall dramatically. They simply became quieter, smaller, and less relevant. Their discipline kept them intact, but intact does not mean powerful. Nomads MC, movement without shelter. The Nomads Motorcycle Club built its identity on mobility. Unlike clubs anchored to fixed clubhouses and visible territories, the Nomads preferred movement. Chapters shifted locations. Meetings changed venues. Presence was temporary by design. This fluid approach reduced exposure and frustrated traditional policing methods that relied on fixed targets. For years, the Nomads survived by never staying long enough to be pinned down. Mobility created a sense of freedom within the club. Members valued the lack of permanent infrastructure, seeing it as insulation from asset seizures and surveillance. Without prominent clubhouses, there were fewer obvious places to watch, fewer assets to freeze, fewer symbols to dismantle. The Nomads believed adaptability itself was protection. If pressure increased in one area, they moved. If attention followed, they dispersed. The lack of centralized space weakened internal cohesion. Without consistent meeting points, communication relied heavily on digital channels. That dependence created records. Messages replaced face-to-face conversations. Coordination became logged rather than remembered. The Nomads traded physical invisibility for digital footprints, a trade that favored investigators patient enough to assemble fragments. Recruitment also suffered. New members struggled to find stability in a constantly shifting structure. Belonging felt temporary, identity felt diluted. Other clubs offered clear territories, clear hierarchies, and tangible symbols of power. The Nomads offered movement and uncertainty. For some, that was appealing. For most, it was not enough to justify the risk. Financial organization became increasingly difficult. Mobility complicates income generation. Without stable fronts or long-term operations, revenue streams fluctuated. Short-term gains replaced sustained systems. When law enforcement disrupted a single transaction, there was little buffer. Asset seizures hit harder when assets were already minimal. Survival required constant motion, but motion drained resources. Leadership faced unique challenges. Enforcing discipline across a moving network is difficult. Standards varied. Decisions took longer to implement. Chapters developed independent habits. Unity weakened as distance grew. The very decentralization that once protected the nomads from collective collapse began eroding their identity as a single organization. Public perception faded rather than intensified. The nomads were rarely in headlines, but absence from headlines did not equal strength. Influence depends on recognition. As visibility dropped, so did relevance. Fear diminished quietly, businesses stopped reacting, rivals stopped caring. The club became a rumor rather than a presence. Law enforcement adjusted accordingly. Instead of chasing locations, agencies tracked people. Movement patterns were analyzed over time. Mobility became predictable through repetition. The nomads were not caught because they stayed still, but because they moved in ways that could be mapped. Freedom of movement became a dataset. Over time, exhaustion set in. Constant relocation strains members physically and financially. Older members slowed, younger ones questioned longevity. Without stable infrastructure, aging brought vulnerability. Health issues, family pressures, and legal fatigue reduced willingness to stay mobile indefinitely. Attrition followed, not through arrests alone, but through withdrawal. The Nomads MC illustrate a critical limitation of adaptability. Movement delays confrontation, but it does not eliminate it. In a connected world, motion is tracked as easily as location. Survival strategies built on evasion must evolve faster than the systems chasing them. The Nomads' approach bought time, but time exposed patterns. Gladiators MC, strength that refused to evolve. The Gladiators Motorcycle Club built its reputation on physical presence. From the beginning, the club projected toughness as its core currency. Size, aggression, and readiness for confrontation defined its identity. Where others relied on myth or legacy, the Gladiators leaned into immediacy. If fear was needed, it was delivered face to face. That approach carved space quickly, especially in environments where intimidation still carried weight. Early success came from simplicity. The Gladiators did not overextend or overcomplicate. Clear territory, visible membership, and rapid response to threats created local dominance. Their members cultivated reputations individually and collectively. This reinforced internal loyalty and external caution. For a time, strength alone was enough to deter interference. Problems were solved before they escalated. But physical dominance ages poorly. As enforcement strategies evolved, strength lost leverage against systems designed to neutralize confrontation without engaging it. Police no longer needed to meet force with force. They relied on planning, surveillance, and timing. The Gladiators' readiness for conflict became irrelevant when conflict was avoided entirely. Arrests happened quietly, away from club gatherings, in moments chosen for control rather than spectacle. Technology accelerated that imbalance. Strength depends on presence, but presence became trackable. Vehicles were logged, associations were recorded, movements were predictable. The club's emphasis on showing up created reliable patterns. Investigators did not need informants when behavior itself told the story. The Gladiators' consistency, once a sign of discipline, became a roadmap. Internally, the culture resisted change. Adaptation was equated with weakness. Caution was mistaken for fear. Younger members were encouraged to uphold tradition rather than question it. This rigidity discouraged strategic thinking. When pressure increased, responses defaulted to confrontation. Even when confrontation was counterproductive, every reaction validated enforcement assumptions. Financial sustainability suffered as a result. Physical intimidation does not translate well into modern income generation under scrutiny. Revenue streams narrowed, opportunities closed. Asset seizures disrupted operations quickly because buffers were limited. Without diversified income, loyalty weakened. Members began weighing risk against diminishing returns. Strength without stability could not sustain commitment. Media narratives compounded decline. Coverage framed the Gladiators as relics strong but outdated. Arrests were contextualized as predictable outcomes rather than dramatic events. This framing stripped intimidation of its mystique. Fear relies on uncertainty. Once outcomes feel inevitable, fear loses effect. The gladiators became known not for dominance, but for resistance to change. Leadership struggled with identity. To evolve meant abandoning the very traits that defined the club. To remain unchanged meant accelerating decline. The club chose preservation over transformation, believing endurance would outlast pressure. But endurance without adaptation is static. While systems evolved, the gladiators held their ground, and the ground shifted beneath them. Recruitment slowed. Prospective members saw risk without innovation. Other clubs at least attempted discretion or digital awareness. The gladiators offered tradition and confrontation in a world that punished both. Younger generations, raised in environments where power is subtle and influence is invisible, found little appeal in overt dominance. Numbers stagnated, then declined. Over time, the club contracted quietly. Territory narrowed. Activity reduced. Confrontations became rare, not from restraint, but from necessity. Strength remained, but opportunities to use it vanished. The gladiators did not fall in a dramatic clash. They were outpaced by an environment that no longer valued what they offered. The lesson in their decline is stark. Power based solely on physicality cannot survive systemic change. When rules, technology, and public perception evolve, strength must be redefined. The Gladiators Motorcycle Club remained loyal to a version of power that once worked, trusting it would work again. It did not. In the end, refusal to evolve proved more damaging than any external force. The gladiators were not defeated by rivals or overwhelmed by numbers. They were bypassed. In a world that neutralizes confrontation before it begins, raw strength becomes background noise, and noise, no matter how loud, eventually fades when no one needs to listen. Black Uhlans MC, Elitism. Under a microscope, the Black Uhlans Motorcycle Club cultivated exclusivity as power. Membership was selective, numbers were controlled, and image was tightly curated. Unlike mass recruiting clubs, the Black Uhlans positioned themselves as elite, disciplined, deliberate, and insulated. Scarcity amplified mystique. Fewer members meant fewer leaks. Fewer chapters meant fewer targets. For a time, elitism worked as camouflage. Their operations favored precision over volume. Activities were compartmentalized. Roles were clearly defined. The club avoided loud displays that invited attention. This restraint created an aura of competence that discouraged interference. Where others sought dominance through presence, the Black Uhlans relied on reputation. The implication was simple: if you knew, you knew. If you didn't, you weren't meant to. But exclusivity creates traceability. Small circles are easier to map once identified. As intelligence methods improved, the Black Uhlans' tight structure became legible. Associations repeated, meetings aligned, travel patterns overlapped. What once looked discreet revealed consistency, and consistency invites scrutiny when observed long enough. The microscope does not need crowds, it needs clarity. Technology undermined selectivity. Even careful members generated metadata, calls connected the same nodes. Vehicles appeared on the same routes. Financial transactions linked familiar names. Investigators did not require mass surveillance, they required patience. Over time, fragments assembled into complete pictures. Elitism reduced noise, but it also reduced ambiguity. And ambiguity is a shield. Legal frameworks magnified exposure. Conspiracy statutes do not care about size, they care about coordination. Clear chains and defined roles simplified prosecution. Precision in operation translated to precision in court. The very discipline that prevented chaos supplied narratives of intent. What was meant to minimize risk instead clarified responsibility. Public perception shifted quietly. The Black Uhlans rarely dominated headlines, but when they appeared, coverage emphasized organization and intent rather than spectacle. This framing removed glamour. Elite no longer meant untouchable, It meant deliberate. Deliberate actions carry heavier consequences. The club's brand became associated with inevitability rather than fear. Recruitment slowed as barriers rose. Selectivity limited replenishment. Younger prospects weighed exclusivity against visibility and chose distance. An elite identity is attractive only when benefits are clear. Under sustained pressure, benefits shrank while costs remained fixed. Without scale, attrition mattered more. Each loss reduced capacity disproportionately. Financial resilience weakened. Smaller networks lack redundancy. When assets were targeted, recovery was slower. Legal costs consumed reserves. Opportunities narrowed. Precision requires resources. Resources require flow. As flow tightened, operations constricted. Elitism could not manufacture buffers where none existed. Leadership faced constrained choices. Expansion threatened identity. Retrenchment threatened relevance. Maintaining the status quo preserved image but accelerated decline. Adaptation risked dilution. The club opted for control over growth, believing discretion would outlast scrutiny. But scrutiny was systemic, not reactive. Waiting it out was not a strategy. Odin's Warriors MC, mythology as armor, data as a weapon. The Odin's Warriors motorcycle club wrapped itself in symbolism. Norse imagery, ritualized identity, and mythic language formed a shield around the club's operations. This was not aesthetic alone. It was strategy. Myth creates distance. It turns ordinary actions into coded meaning and deters outsiders who lack context. For a time, that symbolic armor worked. The club appeared cohesive, purpose-driven, and difficult to penetrate. Ritual strengthened internal bonds. Symbols reinforced hierarchy. Shared mythology offered members a sense of destiny beyond profit or territory. This cohesion reduced casual leaks and discouraged impulsive behavior. Odin's warriors valued restraint, visibility was controlled, presence was purposeful. Their operations favored patience over provocation, allowing the club to exist without drawing constant attention. The club's controlled exposure created predictable rhythms. Meetings aligned with ritual calendars, travel coincided with symbolic events. These consistencies, meaningful internally, became markers externally. Investigators did not need to understand the mythology, they needed only to observe repetition. What felt sacred became scheduled, what felt private became traceable. Technology introduced contradictions. Myth encourages timelessness, but digital records are permanent. Images shared for internal affirmation lingered beyond intended audiences. Messages meant to reinforce loyalty were archived automatically. The club's careful culture reduced volume but increased clarity. Fewer communications meant each one carried more weight. Precision sharpened evidence. Public perception shifted subtly. Media coverage framed the club less as enigmatic and more as deliberate. Symbolism was translated into organization. Organization implied planning. Planning implied intent. This reframing removed mystique and replaced it with prosecutorial narrative. Myth lost power when explained plainly. Recruitment slowed as the symbolic barrier rose. Myth attracts those seeking meaning, but it also repels those seeking flexibility. Younger prospects, fluent in digital realities, recognize that symbolic identity does not shield against legal consequence. Commitment felt irreversible, exit felt costly. Many chose distance over devotion. Financial constraints emerged quietly. Ritual does not generate revenue. Controlled operations limited diversification. Asset targeting, even when selective, disrupted stability. Legal expenses accumulated. Without scale or flexibility, recovery lagged. The club's deliberate pace, once an advantage, delayed adaptation to tightening constraints. Leadership faced a dilemma rooted in identity. To modernize risked diluting myth. To preserve myth risked irrelevance. Adjusting communication practices challenged ritual norms. Reducing symbolic gatherings weakened cohesion. The club chose preservation, trusting that discipline and meaning would endure pressure. But pressure was not cultural, it was systemic. As enforcement matured, symbolism became searchable context rather than camouflage. Analysts linked events, locations, and participants without engaging the narrative itself. The club's story mattered less than its footprint. Mythology provided cohesion but could not reduce exposure in a connected environment. Over time, influence narrowed, activity became cautious, rituals reduced in scale, presence receded from public awareness. The club did not fracture dramatically, it condensed. Devotion remained among a shrinking core, but reach diminished. Myth preserved identity, not power. The decline of Odin's Warriors MC illustrates a modern truth. Stories unify people, but data unifies cases. Symbolic armor protects against misunderstanding, not observation. In an era where systems prioritize correlation over meaning, mythology cannot outrun measurement. The club endured by believing in its story, but survival in the present demands more than belief. When data becomes the dominant language, even the most carefully constructed myths lose their protective edge. Red Devils MC, living in someone else's shadow. The Red Devils Motorcycle Club never tried to be the center of attention. Their identity was built around alignment rather than dominance, loyalty rather than leadership. Operating as a support club, their power came from proximity to stronger names, not from independent control. This arrangement offered protection and purpose, but it also defined limits. Living in another club's shadow provides shelter only as long as the shadow remains. For years, that relationship worked. The Red Devils benefited from association without carrying full exposure. Their activities were narrower, their visibility lower. They handled logistics, communication, and presence in ways that avoided direct confrontation. The support role reduced rivalry and simplified survival. Influence flowed indirectly, allowing the club to exist without provoking systemic pressure. Technology accelerated that exposure. Shared events, coordinated travel, and overlapping communications blurred distinctions between primary and support roles. Messages meant for logistics revealed alignment. Photos meant to show loyalty demonstrated association. The club's function as connective tissue became its greatest liability. Support is invisible only when systems cannot see networks. Once networks are mapped, support becomes structure. Internal identity suffered as a result. Members questioned purpose when protection weakened. Loyalty to another club offered fewer benefits under pressure. Risks increased while autonomy remained limited. Without independent identity or territory, the Red Devils struggled to redefine themselves. Transformation required separation, but separation threatened survival. This tension stalled adaptation. Recruitment slowed sharply. New prospects saw imbalance, responsibility without reward. Joining a support club meant inheriting scrutiny without authority. In a climate where even primary clubs were shrinking, secondary affiliation lost appeal. Numbers stagnated. Aging membership intensified vulnerability. Without fresh blood, resilience declined. Financial limitations compounded the problem. Support roles rarely control revenue streams. Income depended on arrangements vulnerable to disruption. When pressure hit the primary organizations, financial flows tightened across the network. Asset seizures and legal costs upstream cascaded downward. The Red Devils absorbed shock without buffers. Public narrative reframed the club as an extension rather than an entity. Media coverage emphasized links over actions. This framing erased individuality. Once perceived as a node rather than an actor, the club lost narrative control. Fear relies on identity. Without it, presence becomes incidental. Leadership faced constrained choices. Asserting independence risked retaliation and exposure. Remaining aligned guaranteed scrutiny. The club attempted caution, reducing visibility and activity, but reduction further eroded relevance. Silence preserved members but diminished influence. A support club without active support becomes redundant. Descendants MC, heritage without a future. The Descendants Motorcycle Club built its identity on lineage. The name itself implied inheritance traditions, passed down, loyalty inherited, status earned through proximity to older established networks. This sense of continuity gave the club early legitimacy. Members believed they were not just joining a group, but stepping into a history that would protect them. Heritage became armor, and for a time, that belief held. The Descendants operated with quiet confidence. They did not rush expansion or seek constant visibility. Their strategy relied on patience and relationships, not spectacle. Many members had long-standing ties to the bikie world through family or association, which reduced internal conflict and reinforced discipline. Trust came pre-installed. Decisions were conservative. Exposure was limited. In a volatile ecosystem, stability felt like strength, but heritage can become a ceiling. As enforcement tightened, inherited relationships became traceable pathways. Investigators did not need to infiltrate. They followed connections already established. Family ties, long known within the culture, were documented formally. What once created trust now created predictable networks. Lineage, when mapped, became liability. Technology amplified this effect. The Descendants' emphasis on continuity produced repeated patterns, shared events, recurring locations, familiar faces across decades. These repetitions simplified analysis. Even minimal digital footprints aligned over time. The club's caution reduced noise but sharpened clarity. Fewer variables made behavior easier to model. Heritage did not confuse systems designed to recognize continuity. Internal challenges emerged as generational realities shifted. Younger members questioned the value of inherited obligation. Loyalty rooted in history felt heavy in a world offering alternatives without legacy risk. The promise of protection through lineage weakened as evidence mounted that history attracted scrutiny rather than deflected it. Commitment without innovation began to feel like stagnation. Recruitment slowed noticeably. Heritage appeals most when it leads somewhere. As opportunities narrowed and consequences grew clearer, fewer prospects were willing to inherit problems. The Descendants faced an aging membership without sufficient replacement. Aging brings experience, but it also brings caution and constraint. Momentum faded. Financial resilience eroded quietly. The club's conservative approach limited diversification. Traditional income sources faced disruption. Asset targeting, even when selective, impacted stability. Without aggressive expansion or modernized structures, recovery lagged. Heritage preserved order, but it did not generate adaptability. Public perception reframed the club as residual rather than rising. Media narratives emphasized continuity with past networks rather than present influence. The Descendants were portrayed as echoes of an earlier era, maintaining form without function. Fear depends on future potential. When a group is seen as historical, intimidation loses force. Leadership faced a narrow path. Reinvention risked alienating the very identity that held the club together. Preservation risked irrelevance. Attempts at incremental change came too slowly to counter systemic pressure. The club chose restraint, believing time would stabilize conditions. Instead, time clarified outcomes. Over years, contraction replaced collapse. Activities reduced, presence diminished. The club remained intact in name, but its reach shortened. Heritage sustained identity, but could not manufacture opportunity in an environment that rewarded agility. What once felt like inheritance began to feel like inheritance of risk. The decline of the Descendants MC illustrates a central paradox. History provides legitimacy, but it also creates traceability. In a connected system, lineage is not a shield, it is a map. Organizations built on continuity must evolve faster than the systems documenting them. The Descendants honored their past faithfully, but loyalty to yesterday does not guarantee a place tomorrow. When heritage becomes the primary asset, the future quietly slips away. Outlaws MC, global reach, local resistance. The Outlaws Motorcycle Club arrived in Australia, carrying international reputation and ambition. Their name promised expansion, structure, and a proven model imported from overseas. Global reach suggested resilience. Connections implied protection. For a time, that confidence translated into momentum. Chapters formed quickly. Recruitment leaned on brand recognition. The Outlaws believed scale and experience would overcome local resistance. Early operations focused on replication. Established rituals, hierarchies, and rules were transplanted with minimal adjustment. This consistency created cohesion across borders, but it also limited sensitivity to local conditions. Australia's bikie landscape had already been shaped by decades of enforcement and adaptation. The Outlaws were not entering an unregulated space. They were entering a hardened environment that recognized patterns immediately. Global connectivity became a double-edged sword. International ties drew attention from multiple agencies. Intelligence sharing did not stop at borders. What once offered insulation through distance now multiplied scrutiny. Communications linking overseas chapters created transnational trails. Investigations widened, not narrowed. The Outlaws' strength in numbers became a network visible across jurisdictions. Technology intensified exposure. Cross-border communication generated metadata that connected local members to international figures. Financial transfers raised flags, travel histories aligned. The club's global identity, meant to deter interference, instead justified broader surveillance. Authorities treated the organization as a single entity rather than isolated chapters. Local discretion was overridden by international context. Internal adaptation struggled. Imported rules did not always fit Australian realities. Cultural friction emerged between expectations and enforcement. Members accustomed to local norms found rigid structures constraining. Leadership faced tension between maintaining global consistency and responding to local pressure. That tension slowed decision-making and diluted authority. Recruitment momentum stalled as consequences became visible. Prospects weighed prestige against exposure. Joining a globally recognized club promised status, but it also guaranteed attention. In an environment where anonymity increasingly equaled safety, fame lost appeal. Numbers plateaued, then declined. Attrition outpaced replenishment. Financial strain revealed structural weakness. Global affiliation did not guarantee local revenue. Asset seizures disrupted operations quickly. Legal costs accumulated across jurisdictions. Funds diverted to defense reduced investment in growth. Without financial insulation, chapters became cautious. Caution reduced activity. Reduced activity reduced income further. The cycle tightened. Public perception reframed the outlaws as imported rather than embedded. Media narratives emphasized foreign influence and organized expansion. This framing justified aggressive enforcement and reduced sympathy. Fear depends on belonging. When a group is seen as external, resistance hardens. Communities cooperated. Businesses distanced themselves. The outlaws lost local leverage. Leadership attempted recalibration. Visibility decreased. Operations became quieter, but the brand itself ensured continued attention. Global recognition cannot be switched off locally. The club could not unring the bell of notoriety. Adaptation arrived late and incomplete, constrained by the need to align with international identity. Over time, contraction replaced conquest. Chapters consolidated, influence narrowed. The outlaws did not vanish, but they stopped growing. Presence became maintenance rather than expansion. Survival required minimizing risk rather than asserting power. The promise of global dominance gave way to localized endurance. The Outlaws MC illustrate the limits of scale in a connected world. Global reach multiplies opportunity only when systems are fragmented. When systems coordinate, reach multiplies exposure. Imported strength must adapt or be neutralized by environments that understand it better than it understands them. In the end, the Outlaws were not undone by a single rival or law. They were slowed by friction between global ambition and local reality, between recognition and anonymity, between identity and adaptability. Their fall was not dramatic, it was procedural. In modern Australia, power belongs to those who blend, not those who broadcast. The Outlaws broadcasted their arrival. The system responded, and once response becomes routine, even the largest names learn that reach without restraint is not dominance, but visibility waiting to be managed.